Let me, if I might, just speak to the issue that's before us today, because we're debating a tax proposal. And on January 1st of 2011, just 17 days from now, families and small businesses across this country are going to see their taxes go up if Congress doesn't take action on the tax relief proposal that is currently before the United States Senate. Now, there are elements of this proposal that I don't like. I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of us in here who, if we were able to write this, certainly wouldn't have written it exactly in the fashion that we have it in front of us today. But letting the perfect become the enemy of the good will result in one thing, and one thing only, Mr. President, and that is higher taxes across America in 2 weeks. Now, it's easy to stand on the sidelines and to criticize this proposal, and it's perhaps even politically expedient to stand on the sidelines and criticize this proposal. But let me make one thing very clear, Mr. President. Advocating against this tax proposal is to advocate for a tax increase. And that is something that we cannot, in the American economy, cannot afford. Now, it would be great if we could wait a few weeks until we have the changeover in the Congress. I, frankly, would be very happy to see a bill written a few weeks from now when the newly elected Republicans are going to be sworn in. But that is a luxury that just doesn't exist because of this reality that we have, this deadline looming in front of us. If we wait for the perfect proposal, the perfect agreement, then American families and American small businesses are going to pay higher taxes just 2 weeks from now. That's not a scare tactic. That's not political posturing. That, Mr. President, is simply a fact. Taking action now to prevent this tax increase would do a number of things. First off, it would protect 21 million households from being hit by the alternative minimum tax in the year 2010. It would preserve relief from the marriage penalty. There are many provisions in the tax code today, some of which have been addressed in previous tax law, expiring tax law, that lessen the impact of being married. We ironically, in the tax code, punish people for being married in this country. It would prevent job-killing tax increases on many of our small businesses across this country, and it would protect farmers and ranchers from a death tax that would confiscate over half the value of the family farm. Now, what happens if we don't pass this tax proposal? Well, according to a number of economists, you're going to see a drop in the gross domestic product from somewhere between 1.7% to 2%. That's according to a number of private economists. Even the Congressional Budget Office suggests that next year you would see about a 1.4% impact, negative impact, in our economy, in the gross domestic product, if we don't take the action that's necessary to prevent these tax increases. Now, failure to act now, according to the Tax Foundation, with regard to my state of South Dakota, would cost the average family in South Dakota about $1,700 a year in higher taxes. The average American household would be faced with higher taxes to the tune of about $3,000. Now, if we don't take the steps that are necessary to address the death tax, on January 1st, the death tax kicks back in at $1 million exemption, and everything above that would be taxed at 55%. So imagine the impact on a farmer, a rancher, a small business person in this country who is trying to pass on that operation to the next generation, and what this would mean in their ability to do that. Now, as I said earlier, this is not a perfect agreement, but no compromise is. And the fact that we are dealing with Democrats who still run both the House and the Senate and the White House, if we want to stop taxes from going up on everyone, then we're going to have to figure out a way to get that done. And without action, and if we stand around and to try and debate the perfect, then taxes are going to go up on families and small businesses, and our economic recovery is going to stall out. I think it's also important to note that it's going to send a negative message to the financial markets. I think if we don't take action to address this particular crisis that's looming in front of us on January 1st, we can expect that the 9.8% unemployment rate could go significantly higher. And so I would simply argue, Mr. President, that inaction is not an option. And advocating against this proposal is no different than advocating for higher taxes. And I hope that my colleagues will see their way to support this today and to support it in big numbers, because it'll go from here over to the House of Representatives, and they're going to look closely, I think, at the vote coming out of the United States Senate. And I think it's fair to say that if and when it gets to the House of Representatives, that it will pass, provided that the United States Senate sends a very strong message, and I think consistent with the will of the American people, who, according to public opinion polls, and one as most recent as this morning, 70% of Americans believe and agree that this tax proposal ought to be enacted and signed into law. Now, the real issue, I think, Mr. President, that affects our fiscal situation in this country isn't the fact that we don't have enough revenue, it's that we spend too much. Now, if you look at the historically, and it's an empirical fact, if you look historically at what happens when you lower taxes, you look at the John F. Kennedy, you look at Ronald Reagan, you look at George W. Bush, in recent history, anytime you lower marginal income tax rates, taxes on investment, you get not less revenue, but more revenue. That's an empirical fact. You also get a growing economy, and when you have a growing economy, obviously it is generating and creating more jobs, and that's what we all want to see happen. We want to get this 9.8% unemployment rate down. And so I would argue, Mr. President, that the issue that we have in front of us here with regard to spending and deficits and debt doesn't have to do with the fact that we don't have enough revenue. It has to do with the fact that Washington spends too much. And that, Mr. President, is where we ought to be targeting and focusing our efforts. Historically, if you look in the last half century, I think the amount that we spend for our government as a percent of our gross domestic product hovers somewhere in the 20.5% range, and today it's about 25% that we're spending on government as a percentage of our total economy. We've complicated and added to that burden by enacting major legislation in this last year. The massive new health care entitlement program, when it's fully implemented, is going to cost on the order of $2.5 trillion. You've got lots of other legislation that's moved through here. The stimulus bill that was passed earlier this year was $1 trillion of borrowed money, which didn't have the desired impact. The one thing that we know with certainty, at least based on history, is that when you raise taxes, you get fewer jobs. When you lower taxes, you get more economic activity and more jobs for the American people, and frankly, more revenue. And that helps to deal with the issue of the deficit and the debt. Now, in this particular proposal, there is some new spending. There's unemployment benefits included in here. I would like to see that offset. I had an amendment that would do that would pay for the additional spending that's in this bill. We're not going to have the opportunity to offer amendments, but there are going to be a couple of motions offered by my colleague from Oklahoma, Senator Coburn, motions to suspend the rules and pay for the additional $56.5 billion in new spending as a result of extending unemployment benefits in the bill. I think that's important for us to do. Since we got into this recession, we've spent, I think, about $124 billion that we've borrowed from future generations for these extensions that we continue to pass for unemployment benefits. This particular one would take us up to almost $180 billion in borrowed money to pay for these things. It makes sense, in my judgment, when you're spending new money, that you ought to offset or pay for that. And frankly, Mr. President, I would like to see that as part of this proposal. It's not in there. As I said, I have an amendment to rectify that, which won't be considered because we're not being given the opportunity to offer amendments. But I will support the motion to suspend the rules and pass a pay-for the unemployment benefit extension that the senator from Oklahoma will offer later. But all that to say again, Mr. President, that the real issue here, in my judgment, comes down not to an issue of revenue, it comes down to an issue of spending. And I think the American people recognize that, and I think that's why there is such broad public support for this tax proposal, because the American people recognize that you can't raise taxes in the middle of a recession and expect the job creators in this country, our small businesses, to create jobs. It's just counterintuitive, and it defies all empirical knowledge and experience that we have to suggest otherwise. I think, on the other hand, the American people do believe that government has gotten too big, that it is growing too fast, and that it needs to be reined in. And that's where we have got to attack the spending side of this equation. And I believe that when the new Congress is seated next year, that there is going to be an intense focus on this issue of spending, and it's high time that that happen, because it's high time that we get the deficit issue that will plague future generations under control. And the real issue here with regard to that, Mr. President, doesn't have to do with revenue, it has to do with spending. And so I would urge my colleagues to support this proposal. As I said earlier, it's not perfect, certainly not in my estimation, nor I think in the eyes of many people who have looked at this, but on the other hand, it does prevent us from January 1st seeing a massive tax increase, the largest tax increase in American history, start to hit American families and American small businesses, and that's why I hope we'll be able to pass it out of the Senate with a big bipartisan vote. Mr. President, I yield the floor.